Tonight I want to talk about a very important building block in our relationships. I want to talk to you tonight about communication. Communication is the foundation of all of our relationships, so no matter who you are or what stage of life, whether single or married, young, old, or in between, I don't think anybody's old anymore because the old people are those 20 years ahead of you. And there's always somebody somewhere in the world that lives to about 110 or 120, and that's old. I suppose if you reach 100, you will probably confess that you're old. But short of that, I'm not sure. But regardless of who you are, good communication is the foundation of all relationships. Friendship is built on communication. Marriage and family is built on communication. And our relationship with God is based on communication. Some of the things that I will talk about tonight, if we don't understand, will hinder our relationship with God. Because ultimately, our whole life, we are relational people. Relationship requires communication. And the ultimate form of communication you might call communion. So we as human beings thrive on relationship and communication. We can't really exist without it. And in that sense, we are created in God's image. God is a communicator. Now, we can't peer into eternity past, and some people try to build big philosophies about what God must be like based on eternity past. But I think time is really irrelevant to God. All I can say is that God wanted fellowship. He created the angels at some point, and then He created us as human beings at some point. He wanted more than the glory that He receives from the inanimate creation, more than what He receives from sun, moon, and stars, more even than what He receives from plants and animals that are created to demonstrate His glory. But He wanted people that He could communicate with, that He could have fellowship and relationship with. And you'll notice that He communed with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And the way it's phrased in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, if you want to look at this as somewhat of a starting point, that it appears that when God created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden before they sinned, there was a regular time of communication and communion, fellowship. The voice of God or the sound of God was present in the garden. But when they sinned, suddenly that broke the communication. Genesis 3:8, the New King James, they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So when they sinned, they began to hide from God's presence. In verse 10, if you go on, Adam explains, I heard your voice and I was afraid. Before sin entered, he wasn't afraid. So there was perfect communion. And as I said, it seems, when it says the cool of the day, it seems the Lord chose a certain time every day. Perhaps the early evening, the cool of the day, or perhaps the early morning, or perhaps both. But there were times of regular communion and fellowship with Adam and Eve that was disrupted by sin. But God, even after the human race fell into sin, God has always sought a people who would serve Him. And God has always wanted to communicate His plans to His people. For example, before He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18:17, the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? And He went and talked to Abraham. Verse 33, so the Lord went His way as soon as He had finished speaking with Abraham. And Abraham returned to his place. The prophet Amos asked in chapter 3:7, surely, or stated, surely the Lord God does nothing unless He reveals His secret to His servants, the prophets. And you know, we are living in the end of time. We don't know exactly when the Lord is going to come back to earth again. But we have a sense that His coming is drawing close. So while the world just rocks on with various events and just seemingly bouncing from one crisis to another, we, the people of God who are in communion with Him, we can see what's going on. We can see a thread running through history. We can see a pattern forming. We can see that there's God's plan above and beyond human plans, because God will let us know what's going on. God will let us know what He's doing. And then one very powerful passage of Scripture in talking about communication with Jesus Christ, He calls us His friends. Now, we are His servants, His slaves, in the sense that we should be willing to do His bidding no matter what. But we are more than His servants. He said in John 15:15, "No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things that I heard from my Father I have made known to you." Now, sometimes if you're bewildered, confused, discouraged, don't know what's going on, we all feel like that at times. But when we go to God in prayer, or as the psalmist said, when I went into the sanctuary, when you get into atmosphere of praise and worship, when you start praying, it's not always that you get certain facts communicated to you, but you do get a different perspective, don't you? A lot of fears dissolve. A lot of frustrations go away. A lot of confusion becomes clarified, and you get direction for your life. You know what the next step should be. Why? Because you're in fellowship, you're in communion or communication, and the Lord is going to speak to you. That's the essence of friendship and the essence of communication. So with that foundation, let me just take a few minutes tonight to talk about what makes good communication. And I think we can apply this, as I said, to friendship, to marriage, to family, to our relationship with God. So whatever relationships you have at the moment, you tailor them or adjust what I'm saying to them. Thinking about what makes for good communication, I thought about several principles. First of all is trust. There has to be a certain level of trust if you're going to communicate. When you don't trust, you're guarded. And certainly, when you're faced with an unknown situation, or maybe even a situation where somebody has abused or betrayed your trust, there is a time to be guarded. But if you're going to have good communication, and if you're going to have a good relationship, you have to move beyond mistrust to trust. And sincere, honest communication depends on a level of trust that you must build. If you don't have that, that's a red flag to say this relationship is not what it could be or should be. And of course, a relationship must be based on honesty. I shared with you earlier the report from the professor who did the study that even in a secular sense, he says honesty is still the best policy. When we tell little white lies, which are so common and accepted in our culture, and people don't feel like there's anything wrong with saying small lies for personal advantage, but he says that erodes relationships. It erodes trust. It blocks communication. And even the person who's telling the lies suffers because he doesn't get good feedback. He doesn't have a clear relationship with those he's talking to. So in many ways, even small lies hurt us. So if you're going to be in a good relationship with good communication, it has to be based on honesty. If you're not prepared to say everything, that may be your prerogative, but don't lie about it. Be quiet about it, or say what you want to say and no more. Sometimes I tell people, sometimes well-meaning people, maybe even not so well-meaning people, want to pry information out of you. Well, if you're going through a crisis, or if there is a difficult situation that you don't feel like you should share, if it's someone very close to you, that a mentor or a true friend, you'll want to share those things. But to others, you may not want to share. That's your prerogative. So sometimes you have to have a little pat answer already made up in your mind, so you're not caught on the spot and feel like you have to lie to get out of it, but you simply say, well, pray for me, or I'm going through a trial, but God is helping me. And if they ask you, well, what's it about? Well, it's a trial. Well, what kind of trial? Well, it's a trial. And if they don't get the message, you just keep telling them what you want to tell them. So you don't have to lie about it. You can tell the truth. So we must learn the art of knowing when to be silent, or knowing when to be discreet, or knowing how to plan what to say without crossing the bridge from honesty to dishonesty. Because you'll start hurting relationships, especially with those you value the most, if you're not honest. One instance of dishonesty can seriously damage a marriage because it's based on trust and based on honesty. It's much better, even with your spouse, to say, I'm praying about something, or I'm talking to Pastor Bernard about something. It'd be better to be guarded even in that case, if that's what you have to do, rather than tell a lie, because that erodes the relationship. Of course, good communication is based on openness. That is related to honesty, but it's something you're not trying to hide something. You're not trying to disguise. You're not trying to pretend. You're not trying to hold everything in. As I said, there's some things that are private. It depends on each relationship and the level of that relationship. But the closer the relationship, the more open that you are. And that openness encourages openness. And then I will say this. It needs to be paired with honesty, and that's kindness. Sometimes people mistake honesty for rudeness, and then some use an excuse. The reason why they're lying is they don't want to be rude. Well, you have to learn how to be kind. Honesty doesn't mean you say everything you're thinking. Honesty doesn't mean you say everything you know. And honesty doesn't mean you have to say what you're wanting to say in the most blunt and crude way possible. There is a tactful way to communicate some things, and there is a way to be considerate. And sometimes with our closest friends and family members, for some reason, we think we can discard the ordinary standards of politeness and kindness. That's my spouse, so I can say what I want. And I've made this point before, but for some strange reason, on our job, we generally know how to communicate properly to our boss. Even if our boss acts irrationally, unfairly, unjustly, somehow we generally figure out a way either to bite our tongue or to put a smile on our face and think about it, cool down, and express our concern or our frustration in a socially appropriate way that actually gets the boss to thinking. But then we come home and we face the same situation. All those negotiation skills go out the window, and we tell it like it is. And we harm the relationship that's closest to us. So we need some kindness in the midst of our communication. And then, practically speaking, good communication requires time and opportunity. If you're going to communicate, you can't just pick and choose when you're going to have quality communication. You have to spend time together. You see that in a marriage. You see that in parent-child relationships. You know, it's typical for, and sometimes happens in reverse, but it's typical for a woman in a marriage to desire more communication than the man. And so when she finally expresses this, when the man finally takes it seriously, perhaps after sitting him in an office, then he sits, the next time he sits down, draws up the chair and says, okay, let's communicate. What do you want to say? I've got 30 minutes here. Talk. It doesn't work. You cannot program communication. It's like you're a teenager, or for that matter, your 8-year-old, or for that matter, your 2-year-old. You say, this is your dad. I'm ready for quality communication time. What was your day like? Okay. What happened at school? Nothing. Did the teacher teach anything new? No. Did you talk to your friends? No. What did you do? Not much. And there's your quality communication. But you know what? If you say, hey, I got to go pick some up. Want to get in the car and go with me? Or, hey, I'm going to go look at a new car. Would you like to go? And then you're driving down the road, and your child that doesn't communicate in anything except monosyllables will suddenly say, hey, Dad, have you ever wondered about such and such and such? You say, yeah. And then all of a sudden you get a profound philosophical discourse on human relationships. Something they've been obviously thinking about a long time, and they blurt it out. But it doesn't come when you program it to come. So this idea of, well, we want to spend quality time together. That's true. You want to spend quality time. Just sitting, let's just say, for example, if your idea of quality time, and there's a time to sit down and watch a DVD or something as a family, but if that's all you do, that's not really spending quality time together. It may be time together, but that's not enough. So there is a value in quality time, but you can't structure it. There has to be both quality and quantity. In other words, you have to spend enough time together at routine moments, just daily living, in order for communication to grow naturally. But then there are times where you have to schedule to avoid distractions. So there are times you may have to say, let's go out to dinner, or let's do something Friday, or let's do something Saturday. Let's block out any appointments or visits. Let's turn the phone off or put it on vibrate or just whatever. So there is a time where you have to schedule communication. It's much like the Lord. You have to schedule times to pray. But then there are other times, if you have your mind on the Lord throughout the day and you're playing gospel music on your CD as you're driving down the road, God could interrupt you unexpectedly. And there could be the presence of God just sweep in a situation. So there are those unstructured times when your mind is just on the Lord on a daily basis. You're talking to Him back and forth throughout the day. There are those unexpected moments. But then you can't just live by that. You have to have some structured planned moments as well. It requires both. And sometimes you go over those plans. You know, you might say, I'm going to pray 10 minutes. I'm going to pray 30 minutes. I'm going to pray 1 hour. But it might be the end of that time when the presence of the Lord is just starting to move and you're getting a breakthrough. And you've got to push on beyond the schedule and be in relationship. Now, let me talk a little bit about communication. A big part of it is listening. Actually paying attention, which we all have problems doing. It's easy to talk about ourselves, but it's hard to listen to the other person talking about himself or herself, right? But some guidelines to facilitate communication. There are things we can do to structure communication. For example, if my mom always had the rule, no reading at the table, because reading would block communication, and the table is a time where family got together. Well, I was in college for 7 years as a single adult, and so I overturned that rule because I was the master of my own house, and there was no use wasting a lot of time. I hate to waste time. Sleeping, reading, all this, sleeping, eating, all this kind of stuff is a waste of time for me. And so while I would eat, I would read and get a lot accomplished. When I got married, I found that even though I was the man of the house, that rule was suddenly reinstated. No reading at the table. Quality communication will henceforth proceed at the dinner table. And I'm very glad of that because even though our schedules are busy, the dinner table is one of our best times to connect as a family, which now is very rare in America. It's sad. Many American homes, the evening meal consists of each person watching the TV while they eat, and maybe eat in shifts at their own time or getting fast food at different times. But that's one way you can structure communication, is the family meal. But when you listen, you have to listen with sensitivity and empathy. You've got to look at it from the other person's point of view, not just your own point of view. You've got to think about what they're saying. And I could elaborate on a lot of these points, but tonight I'm just giving an overview. What's really important is not merely to respond to the words, or not merely argue your point versus their point, but you try to understand the underlying message that the person is trying to communicate. Now, I don't believe in playing games. I don't believe in sending hidden signals, saying one thing and meaning another, try to prompt people. When people try to do that to me, I usually miss what they're saying, and they get frustrated and upset because I'm going to say, I'll try to be tactful, but I'm going to say what I really mean, and I'm going to mean what I really say. So somebody goes away reading between the lines, they probably read something that wasn't there. And I've had that happen as a pastor, where I remember one time years ago, talking to a person, I knew that they were struggling to find a job, and so I asked them, how's it going, and did you get a new job, and are you working full time, is it going well for you? And I thought it was a very empathetic pastoral conversation. Several months later, they told me, well, I know you were just attacking us because we weren't paying our tithes. And I said, now that you mention it, I haven't looked at the tithing records in the past 3 months, so I don't really know if you're paying tithes or not. I usually look at it once a quarter and just to try to see what's going on, but I couldn't tell you if you're paying tithes or how much. And they said, well, yeah, you were. You were interrogating us because we're not paying our tithes, and you're trying to find out how much tithes we ought to be paying. I said, no, I was worried because you didn't have a job, and I was hoping you had food to eat, and I was wanting to see what we could do to help you. So when you read between the lines, that's where feelings get hurt. And if you're the kind of person that likes to send messages between the lines, that's not good communication. But my point here is just a little bit different, that people may say something in words, but their intention is far deeper than that. And I'm not talking about playing games. I'm just talking about you don't just take words at the simplest level and say, well, if somebody is just saying this one thing, I can answer that and dispose of it and go away. In other words, people may be wanting to talk, so they might say, well, something about the weather, and you just respond about the weather. Well, that may not be really the ultimate point of the conversation. They're just trying to find a way to open the door, and if you're a little more sensitive, you'll respond, and eventually you'll find out what they're really wanting to talk about. So that's what I'm saying. You can't just respond to the words at one surface. You have to find out what is the point of the conversation, or what is the need of the person, or what is the person really thinking about, what is their concern, what is their problem. Now, a lot of this goes back to differences between men and women. And this is a generalization. It could go both ways. But a lot of times, what we see as problems in a marriage or problems in a relationship is simply that men tend to think and communicate a different way than women. So the sooner you learn that, the better. Now, if you're a man, you will never understand how a woman thinks. If you're a woman, you will probably understand how a man thinks. It's very simple, straight line, basic. And I don't say that to commend, but if a man's hungry, you can pretty well figure that out. And if you feed him, you'll probably make him happy. And so, in some ways, a man is a pretty straightforward, simple creature. But you do have to understand the two different styles of communication. Although you'll never learn to speak the other person's language, at least you'll be able to understand and interpret and translate and try to respond accordingly. But men are more prone to solving problems versus expressing feelings. And I don't know how many times this happened. I have to remind myself. But if my wife, especially if I've come home for the day and she's wanting to share what's happening and share a frustration, this has happened and that's gone wrong, then my tendency is to say, well, okay, here's what I would do if I were you, and I would tell this person that, and I would do this, and I would do that, and let's go on to another subject, and let's go eat dinner, or let's go, I've solved that problem in 30 seconds. You've been worried about it all day long. I gave you the answer. But I gradually realized that's not the thing. She could come up with those answers. She's wanting to share the feeling and the emotion and the experience. So she's not wanting do this and do that. She's wanting, that's too bad, and I'm sorry, and what can I do to help? And, she's wanting empathy, not instructions. So we have to learn to respond emotionally as well as rationally. And, I tell this story, you probably heard this, and there's probably more than one story, but this one kind of sticks out because this shows both sides. I remember one time I was sitting in my chair reading as after coming home from work and trying to relax, unwind, and my wife was gone. She comes in, and I'm not really aware of my surroundings that much. I noticed that she goes by and notice she's doing something, she's carrying something, but she's always doing something, so I don't really focus on that. And after a while, I said, how are you doing? And uncharacteristic, okay. And, well, is something wrong? No. And, then time goes on. I realize the temperature is very cold. Something is wrong. And then I realized she's just about finished bringing in the groceries from grocery shopping. And so I said, what's wrong? I know you're upset. What's the matter? She says, well, if I have to tell you. So then that, it degenerates even further. Well, it finally turns out I should have helped her with the groceries. And that's very true. I should have. And so I said, well, if you would have asked me, well, I would have done it. And she said, well, if I have to ask you, I'll do it myself. And so we finally reached a truce. We made a deal. Even though I'm very obtuse and very have lack of perception and lack of social skill and lack of empathy and sympathy, if she will understand that about my character, and if she wants me to do something, if she will tell me, so that's what she has to do. She has to actually tell me. If she will tell me, I will do my best to do it, even though I'm not thrilled about doing it. So it's a bargain. If she makes sure I get the message, I'll make sure to do what I'm supposed to do. But it's unrealistic for me to read her mind, even though in an ideal world I should be a sensitive husband who would know her needs automatically. But in the real world, that's probably not going to happen. And if it does happen, then that's a gold star day. That's a bonus. That's icing on the cake. But we're not going to take that as the baseline. And so we had to both give in. She had to give in to her ideal of the perfect husband who would know her needs and be sensitive and anticipate them and observe them. And I had to give up and say, I have to learn to listen when she talks and respond when she talks and do what I need to do. So we do have to learn how each other thinks. And instead of trying to change the other person, try to communicate. So we have decided in our marriage, if we don't communicate, we can't address it. And we can't penalize the other person. Even though we think they should know or should understand, we're not going to penalize them unless we communicate. We're not going to take communication for granted. So that's an important thing. Men have to realize that romance goes along with physical attraction. You need both. And also a very important thing, the need for expression without violating a sense of security. We need to be kind and tactful, but a good relationship, you need to be able to express what you're honestly thinking without the other person penalizing you. I see this a lot of time. A person takes a risk of saying, this is the way I really feel, and the other person lashes back to say, you have no right to feel this way. Well, what happens then? The person just withdraws. We have to create a safe environment. Even though I cannot understand why you would think this, why would you feel this? It sounds crazy to me, but I have to take it seriously and honestly and not penalize the person for saying what they're really feeling, but address them at face value and create that safety zone. Now, in closing, I'm going to give you some rules for fighting fair. And if this is in a marriage, you apply. If it's a friendship, you can apply it all across the board, even some of it with God. But here are rules for fighting fair. And I put fighting in quotes because I don't believe in abuse. But if you're saying we never argue, we never have a disagreement, then either you're lying or somebody's not thinking in the marriage. Only one person is thinking. The other person is just a robot. But here's when you have the inevitable disagreement, here's the right way to deal with it. Do not yell, scream, or use harsh or offensive language. That is so common in our society. You've got to break that. And if you'll raise your kids without that, they won't have to have that big problem when they get married. Never resort to physical violence or intimidation. Physical abuse is wrong in God's sight. I don't care who you are, or even the intimidation. Do not withhold physical intimacy in a marriage. That, of course, that would be full physical intimacy. But even in other relationships, don't try to use your affection, whatever way that's appropriately expressed in that relationship. Don't try to use your affection as a weapon. Withhold approval, withhold affection, withhold friendship, withhold expressions, or withhold love, withhold sexual intimacy. That cannot be used as a tool or a weapon. Do not attack one another. Instead, speak about your feelings and needs. And what I mean by that, you can say, here's what I feel. Here's what I think. When you did that, I felt. When you put it on yourself, that opens communication. If you said, you did that, that is attack mode that causes the other person to put defenses up, and they won't listen to what you have to say because they're defending you. And they'll come back with their own points. Well, you did this, and you did that. You might have done, I might have done this, but you did that. So we're both bad off. But when you start putting on yourself, I felt, that's saying, I felt that. Maybe you didn't mean it. Maybe you didn't do it. Maybe it's all in my mind, but this is my feeling. Well, that opens the person up to say, well, I didn't mean that. Or if you felt that way, I didn't intend that, and I'm sorry. And it allows for an open communication. Do not accuse one another of character flaws. Speak about specific actions or problems. Don't say, you're always late. You're always arguing. You're always, when you say that, they can say, well, I didn't do it last week. And then you're arguing about last week. And you're arguing about that. You never, fix breakfast. You never pay attention. Well, I did last year, And so you get this big argument. But deal with the specific situation. This morning I was late for work because of this and this. What can we do to change that? We were late for church Sunday. What can we do to work on that? You deal with a specific issue. When you attack someone, when you say always and never, that's attacking the person's character. They're going to defend themselves. When you raise a specific issue, then you're focusing on the problem, solving the problem, not attacking the person, but working together on the same side. You see, you're supposed to be on the same team. So you're not on opposite side trying to score points against each other. That's when a lot of arguments degenerate into. You're trying to score points against the other person, and the best arguer wins. But when you deal with the problem, you're focused on the solution. Do not discuss matters of which the other person has little or no control, such as physical appearance. That's not fair. That's not fighting fair when you attack a person about their parents. Well, you talk about their mother. What can they do about their mother? It's too late for them to choose another mother. Do not raise issues that have been resolved in the past. If you've really dealt with something, don't bring it up again. If there's a new problem, deal with the new problem. Don't say, well, in last year you did the same thing. Hey, if you dealt with last year and solved it, don't bring it up. Deal with the problem you're really worried about. It's not fair to raise things that have already been resolved. If there's a problem, deal with the problem. Don't bring in all the other stuff. Do not fight in front of others, including the children. Don't fight in front of the other people. Don't fight in front of your children. It's the worst thing you could do for them. And I guess it's okay for them to know sometimes you're upset because you're a real person. But you've got to close ranks, and you've got to be friends with each other, and you've got to model proper behavior. And if you're going to have a serious disagreement, don't do it in front of your kids. And don't do it in public where you make little jokes or jabs against your spouse while you're standing in front of other people talking to them. That sometimes happens in social action. You send little messages to your spouse through other people. You got to communicate up front. Do not humiliate. Whatever you do, don't humiliate. Speak from facts, not assumption, suspicion, jealousy, or rumor. That's a big one. You really have to know what you're talking about. Assume the best, not the worst. Think before you speak. And I have a policy, take a time out if necessary. If you have to physically go to another room, go pray, go take a walk, go take a drive, it's not an excuse for not dealing with the problem. But it means wait until you can calm down and talk rationally about the problem. Or until you can get a mediator if it's that serious. Either party needs to have the right to a timeout without the other person forcing them to instantly communicate when they've already passed the point of it doing any good. Kiss and make up by the end of the day. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath, Ephesians 4:26. You may not be able to resolve the underlying problem, but you can at least agree to disagree peacefully. You should be able to do that by the end of the day. Agree to disagree and say, I still love you. We'll work this out. Tomorrow let's talk about it. Let's call Brother Bernard and we'll set an appointment tomorrow or whatever needs to be done. And then pray together. And that's my conclusion. If you can pray together, that diffuses a lot of things. because that means you have to be vulnerable to God and in front of each other. If you can pray sincerely a repentant prayer and a prayer for your family and your marriage and your relationship, God, not only does God bless and answer, but your spouse hears that humility and vulnerability, and that draws you closer together as a family unit. So, with those admonitions, let's stand and turn around and greet someone in a sincere, honest way, and you can be dismissed in Jesus' name.
Please like, comment, and subscribe.